How realistic do you think it would be to deprogram potentially thousands of people online?
I don't think that is something that can be done.
In the 1950s, a woman by the name of Dorothy Martin claimed she was receiving messages from space pertaining to a coming Great Flood that was to be followed by a catastrophic world war. Martin had been influenced by the then burgeoning Church of Scientology, and while a number of UFO religions would emerge in the coming years, none wound up being as well documented as hers, the Seekers, who were the topic of the incredibly influential case study When Prophecy Fails. Above all else, Martin believed she and her flock had been chosen to be saved by beings called the Guardians that would usher them up to the heavens on December 21st, 1954. Though followers would come and go, Martin at one point found herself leading 33 believers, some of which were deemed heavily committed by observers. This means they had taken actions that were difficult to undo and demonstrated a sincere belief in her predictions. Some members ended long-term friendships, severed ties with families, and quit their jobs. Though the Seekers' beliefs would change based on Martin's visions and intergroup conflict, something that was always consistent was the day of the rapture, December 21st, 1954. As that day approached, the group began to avoid the press and become more and more insular, some would say fanatic. Finally, December 21st arrived. Dorothy and the rest of the Seekers patiently and anxiously waited in her living room for something that never happened. No flood, no catastrophe. It was a night lacking in even signs that could be generously interpreted as relevant. As you can expect, this deconfirmation led many Seekers to abandon the group, but strangely enough, some didn't. And those that stayed became more fanatical and had their faith reinvigorated. Previously skeptical members of the group became more keen, speaking more openly to the press, inviting more newcomers, and more frequently reading signs and messages into everyday occurrences. In 1957, Leon Festinger, one of the authors of When Prophecy Fails, would go on to write his seminal work, A Theory on Cognitive Dissonance, which explores why someone might continue to believe something despite having evidence to the contrary, or partake in actions they know to be harmful to themselves. The work posits, for example, that a smoker may be aware that the habit is dangerous to their health, but continues to smoke anyway. The dissonance between this information and their behavior can create discomfort, which they have several ways of dealing with. Firstly, they may alter their beliefs, opinions, or behaviors related to the dissonance, i.e., they could stop smoking or smoke a brand of cigarette they believe to be less harmful. Secondly, they may seek out new information or inquire entirely new beliefs that don't engender dissonance. For example, they could put their faith in fringe studies that purport smoking is actually safe or even good for you. Finally, they may simply try to ignore the dissonance. Eliminating dissonance is often difficult, but Festinger notes it becomes significantly easier if the individual is in a group that shares the same dissonant belief or behavior. Essentially, the group becomes a kind of support network, each member lessening the other's dissonance and normalizing the behavior. Without this support bubble, Festinger notes, even someone determined to eliminate dissonance may eventually fail and be forced to face reality. He writes, "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. It may even be less painful to tolerate the dissonance than to discard the belief and admit one had been wrong." Briefly, and probably futilely, QAnon refers to the belief that the United States government, if not the entire world, is secretly run by the Deep State, a shadowy organization that exists above and behind the current government as we understand it. While the exact size and goals of the Deep State are ambiguous, it's taken that their ranks include several figures in the public eye, that they are largely pedophiles, and depending on who you ask, also Satanists. When Donald Trump ran for president in 2016, he did so with the intent of exposing and eventually dismantling the Deep State. This theory gained traction in 2017 when a user by the name of Q began posting on the anonymous message board 4chan, claiming to be a high-ranking ally of Trump's in his fight against the Deep State. Since then, Q has regularly posted Q-drops, cryptically written messages pertaining to Trump's current struggle against the Deep State. These messages allude to, or often promise, a coming storm, the date in which Trump and his allies will arrest several high-ranking members of the Deep State and expose their existence to the public. This is a somewhat controversial opinion to hold. While these beliefs certainly sound extreme, they're probably not as fringe as you might think.
You say you believe in theories like this?
Oh, yes, sir, 100%.
A recent YouGov poll found that 32% of Republican-leaning voters would describe QAnon as good for the country. Another poll found that half of Trump supporters asked believe the Democrats were involved in some kind of child sex trafficking ring. Furthermore, the QAnon book, An Invitation to the Great Awakening, stuck around Amazon's bestseller list for months before eventually being ousted by this unicorn coloring book. In fact, QAnon has only been gaining traction, with recent Save the Children rallies attracting hundreds and hundreds of people. So, how did we get here? And where's it going? In this video, I'll be talking about the Q movement, why it got so popular, how it continues to persist, and the direction it may end up taking following the 2020 election and January 6th Capitol building riots. In the course of writing this video, I reached out to Rick Ross, founder of the Cult Educational Institute and professional cult deprogrammer.
Or it could be a collective, but we see people following QAnon in a cult-like way. And when I say in a cult-like way, I mean they become socially isolated. They're in a kind of echo chamber bubble online that they kind of weave, almost cocoon themselves in, where they only access information that supports these conspiracy theories. And then other people that are involved in QAnon reinforce that online through social media and through YouTube channels and so on. So what we do see is that people can be recruited online and they can be sustained online in a conspiracy theory or a group based on conspiracy theories.
First off, though, I'd like to talk about why I characterized my attempt to summarize the beliefs of QAnon as futile, and how that actually relates in many ways to how QAnon is able to grow. There have been many attempts made online to outline or otherwise summarize the core beliefs of the Q movement, many of which are very insightful and intelligently written, but nevertheless always come up against the same problem: that there is a genuinely enormous breadth of beliefs and sub-beliefs that exist within QAnon. As the movement began online on an anonymous forum, it tends to be incredibly malleable, oftentimes with different Q followers having very, very different interpretations of what the movement is all about. This also means it's easy for more or less any outsider's description of Q to be hand-waved away as uncharitable or misleading, but we'll get back to that. In my opinion, perhaps the best example of this belief in practice is the role of current Vice President Mike Pence. Some Q followers believe that Pence is an ally of Trump in his fight against the deep state, and that Trump chose him as a running mate because of his strong religious values. Others, however, believe the exact opposite, that Pence is a deep state operative, with some even claiming that he once attempted to assassinate Trump on behalf of the deep state. If Pence tried to kill the savior figure of your group in order to protect a bunch of pedophiles, that makes him about as close to an Antichrist or Judas figure as I can imagine within the belief. And yet, this discrepancy has caused no major schism within QAnon. People who believe or don't believe that Pence is evil march side by side at rallies, both claiming to represent Q. Now, this inconsistency in core elements of the mythos may initially seem like a weakness of the movement, but in many ways, it's a huge strength. As it turns out, it's really, really difficult to rebuke QAnon when, no matter what belief you point to, there will be 100 people saying, "Hey, we don't believe that, stop trying to make us look bad." I honestly don't think there's any summary of QAnon I could offer that wouldn't be called uncharitable, misleading, or otherwise dishonest. And if you don't believe me, even Q themselves isn't able to control the narrative around the movement. In an AMA, someone asked Q if JFK Jr. was alive, and Q said no. But nevertheless, there are still factions within QAnon that believe JFK Jr. is alive or Trump's secret, real vice president. Mostly these are boomers who have never been able to get over the Kennedys, but still, the point remains that it's very likely that if you get 5 QAnon believers in a room together and ask, you're going to get 5 different explanations of QAnon. This initially seemed like a unique aspect of QAnon to me, but it's actually a fairly well-documented phenomenon. Even in When Prophecy Fails, they at one point state of the Seeker's philosophy, the ideology was not only complex, but pliant, changing this way and that in response to new influences. In my opinion, this is one of the reasons Q is so easy to get sucked into. There isn't just one gateway. There are many.
Masks, they're also not socially distancing. It looks like a mosh pit at a concert.
Unlike many other conspiracy theories like the JFK assassination or Roswell spaceship, QAnon isn't built around one single event. It's more an explanation for why the world feels dark, confusing, and wrong. In this sense, Q casts a pretty wide net. If you're not really into conspiracy theories, or one particular entry point into Q is too out there or zany for you, there's a more toned down explanation of the movement just a few clicks away. Conversely, if you are more conspiracy minded, there are a dozen ways to get into it. Whether you think the government has secret cloning technology, JFK Jr. is still alive, Illuminati pedophiles run the country, that those Illuminati pedophiles just so happen to be Jews, or hell, even if you just enjoy a good cryptic word search, there's a version of Q for you. And once you're there, it becomes a little easier to adopt some of those other beliefs. One of the few central elements of the Q mythos, perhaps the only consistent belief, is that the deep state engages in child sacrifice and pedophilia. This element of Q has become progressively more pronounced with time. This is to the immense frustration of pretty much all child and anti-sex slavery organizations who have unanimously denounced Q. It's pretty terrible for your cause when Googling how to help children leads you down a conspiracy hole rather than somewhere you can actually help out. That said, it's really not hard to see why this element of the Q mythos has become popular. It's incredibly sensational, and saving the children from such a fate is an inarguable moral good. This element of Q can really keep people hooked when they get in. You can't give up, the deep state are sacrificing children to Moloch, and if the Democrats get elected, yours could be next. QAnon's enemies being so despicable also acts as a kind of blanket excuse for any behavior. If someone is even remotely involved in the deep state and what the deep state does, shit. All bets are off. Ignore them, dox them, harass them, anything goes. I've also heard it said of the pedophilia thing that it is a preemptive way to defend Trump from his own allegations of sexual misconduct, some of which did involve minors. It's a very good way to get ahead of the conversation and control the narrative. After all, how can you take your opponents seriously when they regularly throw babies down pits in Carthage? More dangerously though, this angle gives Q an easier in than most other conspiracy theories or cults into the mainstream. The rallying cry of "Save the Children" makes it easy for QAnon to co-opt the iconography and imagery of actual humanitarian efforts. It's also one of the most unobjectionable rallying cries a group could possibly have. No one is against this.
Because it's just, I didn't even know what it was until like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, what is this? What is everybody going crazy about? I'm like, what is this whole thing about QAnon? What are you guys talking about? And then I was like, oh.
Potentially, it's also one of the reasons QAnon was able to so easily spread on social media, and among boomers who have no idea what 4chan is. While your weird aunt might not go to an anonymous anime message board, it's not hard to imagine her seeing a generic Save the Children post from a trusted friend and falling down a rabbit hole. Especially if her particular version of that rabbit hole confirms some biases or beliefs she already had. Something else that makes it easy to fall into QAnon is its bizarre Christian overlap, and elephant in the room here, Dan Olson made a great video about this topic while I was still researching mine, like an asshole. Still, I wanted to get Rick's opinion on this topic, so I asked.
Why do you think that so many cults that outwardly have very little to do with Christianity, under the surface tend to have a very religious or Christian element? I'm thinking specifically of in When Prophecy Fails, they were a UFO cult, but then after a while, they started talking about how, well, you're the reincarnation of Mary and you're the reincarnation of Paul. And with Q, nothing about the text of Q posts is religious in any way. But when you look at memes and when you look at posts that Q people are making, loads of crosses, there is loads of religious iconography in it. And I was wondering, what's your read on that?
Marketing. I mean, basically, what do you want to do to sell your product? If you're in the Arab world, it will be Islam. If you're in the Far East, it may be Buddhism or Hinduism. There are fringe groups, splinter groups from every major religion. And cults in the United States and in Europe frequently trade on Christian imagery and Christian references because it sells. They may also use Star Trek. Anything in popular culture that gives them viability and a better edge in their marketing of their group and their ideas to sell it to the general public. We buy what we know, we buy what we can understand. And so if you market your group as a Christian group, this makes it seem much more reasonable and familiar to people. And so many groups will use whatever religion they think gives them an edge in marketing.
It's also problematic that one of the core beliefs of QAnon is that the world's elites are all enormously corrupt oligarchs that use their power to influence politics to their own ends, because they do. Extreme wealth equating directly to political power and the wealthy putting their own desires above the needs of society at large isn't a controversial belief. It's a fact that's recognized and loathed by most of the population. It's also proven true time and again that if anyone can get away with years of child abuse, it's someone rich with a lot of connections. The problem with these beliefs in QAnon is that, despite what its advocates might claim, QAnon is not a nonpartisan belief.
It's about a deep state trying to drag a crook across the presidential finish line and trying to destroy the man Americans wanted in the Oval Office.
This means that general distrust and hatred for the wealthy must take a more specific form. After all, just look at the hero of the movement, a billionaire who has cut taxes for the rich, shilled for products in the middle of speeches, has connections with known pedophiles, and has pursued economic policy that has ended up losing hundreds of thousands of American jobs. Thus, criticisms by Q believers towards the wealthy become less about actual systemic issues or policy and more about general feelings of disgust and who those feelings can be pinned on. What this means is that, in practice, the deep state isn't just the rich and powerful, it's Trump's enemies. Democrats, Hollywood elites, liberal media, fake Republicans, these are the agents of the deep state that Q believers actually care about. And sure, if asked, a Q believer may say that an oil baron or rich CEO is a member of the deep state, but by and large, those aren't the people that they're obsessed over and posting about. This transforms and focuses the relatively difficult to wrestle with problem of wealth inequality leads a small minority of people to wield unparalleled political power that they then use to pursue their own agendas, regardless of their impact on society at large, into the much easier to handle, the wrong people wield unparalleled political power. Keep in mind that to many QAnon believers, the day of the storm represents the moment in which Trump will not do away with the deep state, but seize power from them. Considering regular old anti-establishment or anti-wealth disparity beliefs aren't controversial to hold, it can actually be very hard for a friend or family member to tell just how deep into QAnon a loved one is, especially in casual conversation. In fact, it can even be difficult for you to tell how deep into a conspiracy you are, no matter how educated or intelligent you think you might be.
I've seen people that are highly educated, very sophisticated people. I've done 5 interventions with medical doctors. One was an orthopedic surgeon, another an anesthesiologist. One woman that I worked with was a clinical psychologist, and she was, in my opinion, totally brainwashed. So very sophisticated, highly educated people can succumb to this kind of manipulation. And it behooves us to understand all the tricks and the methods that can be used to gain undue influence over us. And that is our inoculation. That's the vaccine, if you will. Because I don't think anyone willingly joins a destructive cult or buys into a baseless conspiracy theory. They are tricked and they are manipulated and many times trapped in this mindset. And if we understand the process of recruitment and how people are retained in such groups, we can basically inoculate ourselves against being caught up or trapped in that way. And I think so many people are in denial. We don't want to admit that our minds are as persuadable as they are. But I would say to people, look at the world around you. Look at all the advertising, the negative political ads. If we weren't amenable to persuasion, no one would waste all the money on that. So don't deny that you can be vulnerable. Accept that you are vulnerable and then understand those techniques that might exploit your vulnerability to protect yourself.
An interesting example of veering in and out of belief in the case of the Seekers was Cleo, the daughter of an early and prominent member of the Seekers, who seemed to oscillate between casual and extreme belief. At one point, she skipped an important Seekers meeting to sing Christmas carols and hang out with her friends, but a few days later drove a considerable distance to attend another. She complained several times about how bored she was hearing that the end of the world was coming, but also gave all of her possessions away in preparation for it. Another member of the group, ex-soldier Bob Eastman, was at certain points incredibly devout and did what he was told, but as others seemed totally uncertain. When asked, he once said, "I don't believe and I don't disbelieve, but I am ready to serve if necessary." I find this quote interesting because no matter how Bob would describe himself or his own commitment, he was still spending all of his time in a doomsday cult, and he was still willing to serve if necessary. The 2012 film Compliance is based on an incident that took place in Mount Washington, Kentucky in 2004. Early one morning, the assistant manager of a small McDonald's received a phone call from a police officer who claimed one of her employees was a thief and needed to be detained. Over the course of the day, the individual was held in a small office against her will, where she was questioned and searched by fellow employees at the behest of the cop, whose requests grew more extreme and humiliating. This eventually ended when the phone was handed to a maintenance man that refused to comply. It was later discovered the man on the phone wasn't actually a cop. He was just someone who really wanted to be one. Initially, a lot of people responded to the film with shock that there was only one moral individual working at that McDonald's. However, there are other ways to read the incident. Compliance is an interesting demonstration of a phenomenon known as foot-in-the-door psychology, a little similar to the idea of a sunk cost. The theory stipulates that if you want to get someone to behave in an extreme way or do something they wouldn't usually do, you need to start small. Ask them to do something quick or easy, praise them, then ask them to do something a little harder or more morally dubious, gradually building up. The idea is that by the time the person is on the precipice of doing something truly awful or counter to their own interests, they must wrestle with a question, either consciously or subconsciously. If doing this would be wrong, does that mean everything else I've done is wrong too? Many people don't want to grapple with this as an actual possibility. In a sense, this turns compliance, consistency, or continued belief into a defense mechanism. It makes illogical actions like staying in a cult or harassing someone in the name of an online conspiracy theory seem logical. This is because you don't just have to admit that a belief was wrong. You have to reconcile with everything you've done in the name of that belief.
Friends or family that are following Q?
No, just myself.
And what happens if? Thank you.
They think we're crazy.
Me too. I'm wearing tinfoil hat myself.
Let me put it like you put it. They think we're loco.
Additionally, because the enemy of the Q movement is the deep state, a shadow government that wields incomparable power and influence, it's thus incredibly easy to hand-wave away any person or group that criticizes or makes Q look bad. After all, it's not like the deep state doesn't have the money to fund fake news, crisis actors, or double agents. It is thus incredibly easy to dismiss, and in some cases fairly, people like Baby Q, a random guy on YouTube who purports Q is him from the future sending messages back for current him to decipher.
The guy posting on the boards and running point on this whole operation is actually me in the future. Pretty crazy, right? Be on the lookout for official confirmation from the big man upstairs very soon.
While you and I may look at this guy and think they're just some crazy crackpot or grifter, a Q believer might look at them and think that's a member of the deep state trying to make me look stupid. Even these Save the Children rallies, which are some of the largest in-person Q movements to date, have been called false flags online.
So loaded language, or what we would understand as thought-terminating cliches, like deep state and false flag. This would be a way of interrupting your critical analysis and just basically flipping a switch in your head to shut down your thought process. So rather than consider, what does this mean? What do these facts mean regarding this conspiracy theory? I just say, well, that person is a false flag, that's deep state, and I dismiss it. And I no longer will consider it or try to understand what it means.
This denial becomes especially troubling when the beliefs of Q followers manifest in violent or dangerous ways. A few months back, a real man and not Star Wars character by the name of Alpolis Slyman filmed himself driving his car, screaming at the radio for Trump and Q to help him as he sped away from the police with his young daughter in the back seat. In July, avid Q follower Corey Hurren crashed a van into Rideau Hall in Ottawa in an attempt to assassinate Justin Trudeau. There have been many instances of teenagers being stalked and harassed by Q believers under the impression that they had been kidnapped. More recently, QAnon Mom, who was part of an online group that egged estranged parents on with stories of child sex slavery and evil cabals, kidnapped her twin daughters and killed her legal counsel. If you look up any of these topics online, you will find dozens and dozens of comments claiming that they're simply false flags, lies designed to make QAnon look bad. It's almost like a no true Scotsman argument. Even if you're a loyal Q follower from day one, if you ever mess up or do anything that makes Q look bad, you are probably a deep state operative all along. Now, I don't think it's especially controversial to say this feels like a defense mechanism, a way of lessening the cognitive dissonance that arises when you see a group of people ostensibly on your team cause harm to the world or besmirch the movement. However, when you get to the point where you're willing to call anything damaging to the reputation of your group a false flag, you're in deep. At this point, your beliefs are prevalent and likely even invasive, interfering in your day-to-day life, which is something many QAnoners post about frequently. Unsurprisingly, it's also not uncommon to see posts from QAnon believers talking about how they had to sever ties with their family members because they just didn't understand. It is, of course, easier to hang on to these beliefs when you're thrown a bone every now and then. While Trump himself has been careful not to signal QAnon believers too overtly, he isn't coy enough to completely ignore them either. He's never outright denounced the movement and has mentioned the deep state in vague and obtuse ways on several occasions, even blaming them in part for the government's slow coronavirus response time at the last RNC. Though it may seem like an eternity ago, Trump was actually accusing the opposition of election rigging and voter fraud way back in 2016, when he claimed he actually did win the popular vote. Leading up to the 2020 election, Trump went hard on mail-in ballots, claiming they were unsafe and would lead to the most corrupt election in history. In the weeks post-election, millions of dollars have been spent trying to back this idea up. While the Trump administration's intentions likely weren't to rile up QAnon supporters explicitly, it's hard to deny that this hasn't had a major effect on them. After all, election rigging is obviously something the deep state would do, so much so that to many QAnoners, Trump's loss acts as direct confirmation of their existence, and Trump's railing against mail-in ballots as a concrete, real-world example of the fight between them playing out. That's what's scary about this situation. A lot of people don't see Trump's 2020 loss as a deconfirmation of their beliefs. They see it as a confirmation. Some are even saying that Trump's loss was, in fact, part of the plan to expose just how corrupt the Democrats were. Q later confirmed this idea in a post-election drop, which concluded it had to be this way. For what it's worth, while Trump's many lawsuits may not amount to anything in court, they are not useless as propaganda. A recent poll found that 17% of Americans didn't know who won the election. The January 6th Trumper tantrum at the Capitol building proves just how fervently some people believe these stories of election rigging, or in other cases, prove how badly they want to believe it. The sincerity of the rioters' beliefs in election rigging is second to its primary purpose, to serve as a plausible justification for anger and pro-Trump chaos. It should be noted, however, that there are plenty of posters less optimistic about what this means, with doubtful complaints about Q becoming more and more commonplace. The most frequent response to these doubts is simple: trust the plan. This is a phrase that's become one of the rallying cries of QAnon, and it's not hard to see why. Despite the fact most Q drops are cryptic, Q has outright prophesized many times about things that just didn't happen. For example, in Q Drop 34, Q insisted that martial law and mass arrest would be occurring November 3rd of that year. That didn't happen. Q Drop 856 states that a parade like nothing else will occur November 11th of 2018, which didn't happen. Q Drop 1233 that claims the truth about Haiti would lose the Dems the black vote in 2018. This didn't happen, and as usual, the Dems gained the majority of the black vote and took back the House. The point is, Q prophecies failing is nothing new. Neither is Q stating verifiably untrue information, such as in 1553, where they claim that Hillary Clinton never made a concession speech when she did. These instances are always met in the same two ways. First off, as we've mentioned, is the simple repetition of the mantra, trust the plan. While it may seem innocuous at first, the simple phrase, trust the plan, really does a great job of summing up Q in its entirety. No matter what happens, no matter what failures you might perceive as happening, no matter what your gut tells you, trust the plan. You might not be surprised to learn that many cults throughout history have been a fan of this phrase. Here's another quote from a believer in When Prophecy Fails. No, I don't have a more valid one. I don't think we have to interpret it. We don't have to understand everything. The plan has never gone astray. We don't know what the plan is, but it's never gone astray. I really don't think it can be overstated how telling it is that a phrase that sounds designed as a coping mechanism has now been repeated so much it's become one of the group's main catchphrases and is plastered all over Q-related merchandise. Trusting the plan in the face of obvious counter-evidence is also seen as virtuous and noble in the group. Tests of faith are, of course, also par for the course in a cult. At one point, a member of the Seekers claimed that a guardian would heal a blemish under her eye, and when it didn't, it was a test. It was a test. The other primary way Q believers have dealt with the dissonance of deconfirmation of beliefs is simple. They've acquired, or invented, new information. When Q stated that Clinton, Obama, Tom Hanks, the Hamburglar, and other ne'er-do-wells would be arrested and no arrests occurred, many members of Q simply chose to believe that these arrests did occur. This was problematic as Hillary was still walking around and hosting the worst podcast ever recorded, so QAnon needed an explanation. They came up with several, which get increasingly more sci-fi. The first is that the enemies of Q had been placed under house arrest, and whenever they appear in public, they're wearing tracking devices at all times. Evidence for this claim tends to be that these individuals are often seen wearing baggy clothes designed to conceal their tracking devices and monitors. Times when they aren't wearing baggy clothes is not important. The second explanation is that all of the bad people have been arrested and are in prison, but have been replaced with body doubles. The third and most out there explanation is that they're clones. That the bad people were all arrested and replaced with clones. Now, the obvious counter-argument here is, why bother taking out members of the deep state if you're just going to immediately replace them with people who look and act exactly the same? The thing is though, trying to argue this out may be missing the real purpose of this belief. To eliminate dissonance, to explain why the promised thing obviously hasn't happened. The lengths to which a true believer will contort the truth or fabricate evidence really can't be overstated. The Seekers were at one point so desperate for evidence, they took an obvious prank call at face value. A kid, who we must all admit here, ruled, phoned them and said, "Hey, I'm Captain Video. There's a great flood in my bathroom. You better come fix it." A few hours later, the boy's very confused mother answered the door to some incredibly sad and desperate cultists asking if they could please speak with the spaceman. After the Captain Video incident, a Seeker said, "As we got there, a car that had been parked in front of the house drove away. We missed our cue. We were too late, and we didn't get what we expected." Mate, it's a fucking joke. Even when the day of the flood, the single most consistent element in their mythos, didn't arrive, the Seekers found reasons why. Some thought the flood did occur and it was simply a spiritual flood, whatever that means, and others believed the date had been a test, that the flood was coming, but the outer beings needed to know they'd be ready for it when it did. This is despite the fact that Dorothy was insistent that the day of the flood would not change. After this catastrophic deconfirmation, however, many Seekers didn't leave. In fact, they doubled down. There's a really interesting conversation in When Prophecy Fails that reflects this. Not long after the sources failed to appear, a member of the group named Bob, who was previously one of their most devout acolytes, calls Kitty, a member of the group who left. At the start of the conversation, Bob is doubtful about the validity of the Seeker's prophecies. When Kitty agrees with him, however, he suddenly becomes more defensive and leaves the call with a renewed sense of faith. This reflects what Rick told me. Sometimes when confronting a member of a cult, one of the worst things you can do is call it silly, stupid, or ridiculous, as it immediately puts the other person into a defensive position.
Well, I would say, first of all, to the families, be careful. Develop a strategy of dealing with your loved one who's involved with QAnon. Don't be confrontational, don't be critical, don't make negative remarks. Just be there for them, listen to them, try to be as loving and positive as you can, and then they probably won't cut you off. What typically happens is the family says, this is crazy. These conspiracy theories are nonsense. Look at this information, this news report. When you're confrontational like that, that probably is going to lead to being cut off. So that's why in my book, Cults Inside Out, I devoted a whole chapter to coping strategies, helping families to know what to say, what not to say. But what you see with QAnon is social isolation, which is what you see in any destructive cult. That is to isolate people from any outside frame of reference, any alternative perspective that might undercut what the group believes and what the group wants each and every member to accept. And as I say, they withdraw into this bubble. They become cocooned in a world online. They become so enmeshed in this world, and it dominates them on a day-to-day basis. And they rely on other people in QAnon to reinforce this and also to tell them what to do, to coach them. And so when the family comes or friends come and they offer an alternative perspective, they're dismissed.
This means that even if you have your doubts about the group, the idea of leaving can seem scary and impossible. In many instances, whether someone likes it or not, the other cult members are their social circle now. Even if it isn't healthy, that's hard to walk away from. There are a lot of quotes in When Prophecy Fails that reiterate this point, but this is one I find hard to get out of my head. I have to believe the flood is coming on the 21st because I've spent nearly all my money. I quit my job, I quit school, and my apartment costs me $100 a month. I have to believe. You may have noticed I haven't made too many allusions to the violence that occurred on January 6th at the Capitol building in this video. That's because, fessing up, the majority of this project was finished before that occurred. In fact, as of the time of recording, it's the next day. I think this event needs a little bit of time to reverberate amongst the QAnon community, but I can make a pretty certain guess that a lot of QAnoners right now are exhilarated that this means the day of the storm is finally at hand. Right now, I think a lot of Republicans find themselves at a difficult crossroads. They've been perfectly content stoking the fires of the far-right contingency within their party for years, catastrophizing about BLM or trans representation or gun control, whatever the flavor of the day is, and occasionally throwing a bone to the odd conspiracy nut as well. But despite all their bluster, they don't actually like instability. They like it a lot, and they especially don't like the idea of being held accountable by a mob that have demonstrated they could turn on them. The thing is though, Trump won the Republicans more votes than they'd ever received before in the 2020 election. Right now, a lot of Republican politicians are thinking about Trump and considering whether it's safer to jump ship entirely or change course and head hard into far-right waters. This will be an important moment for Q. I know I'm about to be a little arsey here, and I hope overly dramatic, but I can't help but be reminded of the caning of Charles Sumner right now. Shortly before the first American Civil War, Shortly before the American Civil War, staunch abolitionist Charles Sumner delivered an impassioned banger of a speech before the Senate, calling out the moral evils of slavery. Another senator, very insistent they were not owned by this, approached Sumner at his desk and started beating him mercilessly with a cane while some cronies held everyone else back. This politician was rightly demonized by some, but was lionized by others. The caning of Charles Sumner came to be seen as an irrevocable clarification of one thing: that the rift between these two Americas couldn't be mended.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved, because you'll never take back our country with weakness.
So, where does this leave us? Well, It means that Q is a movement that is, in comparison to other conspiracy theories, incredibly easy to get sucked into. It can market itself in a variety of ways, is resilient to argument and facts-based deconfirmation, and in many ways has just had the key tenets of its ideology confirmed. It spreads easy, is hard to get out of, and has an enormous safety net for anyone who has their doubts. To put simply, I don't think Q's going anywhere. Exactly where it will end up, however, is interesting to consider.
Well, the groups basically disintegrate when a leader dies or a leader is sent off to prison. And we could go through many examples. But in today's world, let's say that a cult, a group called a cult, like, for example, Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard was the founder of Scientology. He died in 1986. The group has diminished. There are less and less members, but they're still going strong. And I would say the reason why is because of the assets of the group. When Hubbard died, Scientology had about $600 million from the Hubbard estate in 1986. Scientology now is reportedly worth somewhere in the area of $3 billion. So when you have great assets, property, cash, etc., there is a desire to go on, and there is a desire to be the new leader. And so David Miscavige, who was a personal secretary to L. Ron Hubbard before his death, became that new leader. But in groups where the leader is jailed and the assets are then liquidated or whatever, and there are many groups like this, it seems like the membership just fades away. But there are people who will be diehards, as I mentioned, with the people that continue to believe in Keith Raniere and NXIVM, despite the fact that he's been convicted on multiple felonies and is now sentenced to 120 years in prison. I think for people who leave a destructive cult, it's important to unpack their experience.
In a recent Q drop, Q referred to the future as a post-POTUS period. While many followers were upset by Q's choice of language, it does tell us that Q themselves might not just go away in January. Some followers looked at it optimistically, that the fight would continue even if Trump was no longer the president of the United States. Others, taking this optimism to the extreme, believe that Trump will assume some kind of shadow president role, where he'll continue to secretly exert influence over the country and carry on his work dismantling the deep state. Which, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is the plot of Metal Gear Solid 2.
Brothers!
Many have theorized that upon leaving office, Trump will launch a MAGA TV or Trump TV to further milk his followers. Indeed, there were even murmurings of this way back in 2016. This makes a lot of sense considering one of the few institutions Trump seems to respect is television, and one of the few things he seems to love doing is talking. We can be certain that MAGA TV would include regular segments where Trump would address the public directly, but other than that, it's anyone's guess. They could attempt to compete with Fox as a right-wing news source, or to grift Trump supporters by selling them as much random crap as possible, or even just broadcast greatest hits Trump moments and speeches for hours and hours at a time. Rick said that one of the reasons cults slowly collapse is that the central figures eventually die, are arrested, or lose power. But in a world where MAGA TV is broadcasting to millions of people every day, who knows what will happen? Trump will not go to prison for anything he did in office, but on the off chance one of his many lawsuits or investigations catch up with him, he might still end up a martyr for the group.
In some ways, Trump losing will end up being very good for the QAnon movement, because a problem they face is Trump was meant to be the savior, he was meant to defeat the deep state. Then he became president, and suddenly there's no excuse for why he isn't doing the things they want. If he's the president of the United States, why isn't he arresting Obama? Why isn't he arresting Hillary? Why has he not exposed the evil deep state members? And now that he's lost, Q can both say, look, the deep state got rid of Trump because, he was too dangerous or whatever, and they now have an excuse for why none of the good things they're promised are happening. It started off with just Trump's going to do all this great stuff when he gets in. Then he started to not do it, And that's when you started to get beliefs like, well, maybe he is secretly arresting people and replacing them with body double. And I feel like Trump's loss in some ways might be a big boon for the QAnon movement.
Well, certainly they may regard him as a martyr, a person who has been victimized by persecution, etc. And that's pretty typical in the world of, you know, failed prophets and doomsday predictions, etc. You will have people like, for example, Keith Raniere. He is right now incarcerated, and he has diehard followers. They see him as someone who has suffered from persecution, and they literally dance outside of the detention center in Brooklyn, New York, to demonstrate their loyalty to him. So there are people that will be loyal to a leader to the nth degree. But I think that a lot of the people that subscribe to QAnon now are kind of parsing quite a bit. For example, they'll say, well, I believe these things that QAnon says, but I don't necessarily subscribe to these other things. And I would say that that QAnon, in my opinion, is not a buffet. It's not this like buffet line that you go down and say, oh, I'll take a little bit of this save the children. I'll take a little bit of this deep state, but then I won't take these other areas of the conspiracy theories. I think it's a worldview, and that once you become involved, it's expected that you will embrace it entirely.
And honestly, okay, it would be a little funny to see what MAGA TV would do if Trump eventually went to jail. It's been theorized for a while now that Q is simply becoming too large for its own good, and that the belief will soon fracture.
Keep interrupting me.
Because you're lying! Because you're full of shit! That's why!
As I've already spoken about in this video, however, Q represents such a wide range of disparate beliefs already that I have a hard time envisioning what a fracture in the movement would look like in any meaningful way. Alex Jones may be venting his frustration with QAnon here, but in my opinion, that's just because he hates the competition. On a similar note, many others have posited that Trump's loss is going to create a vacuum, a space for new online movements and grifters to emerge, but similarly, I have a hard time envisioning this, for a while at least. Some people are turning on him, but as far as I'm concerned, they are in the extreme minority. You see, despite what some Q posters may tell you, Trump is, and always has been, inseparable from QAnon. No one else in the Republican Party, no politician in recent memory has ever engendered the kind of loyalty he has. He is the white knight in shining armor battling the dragon that is the deep state. And as we've seen, any other person, no matter how good an ally or how loyal they may have been, lacks this insulation. Many of Trump's own team have gone to prison or been fired, and at that point, Q immediately turns on them, labeling them disloyal, incompetent, or members of the deep state. Even lifelong simps like Tucker Carlson, who slaveringly takes Trump's side on nearly every issue, was labeled a deep state pedophile without hesitation the moment he did something as small as ask for evidence of voter fraud. The only person who cannot fuck up, embarrass themselves, or fail is him. This is demonstrated well in a really interesting moment of When Prophecy Fails. Dorothy asks a young woman named Bertha Blatsky to attempt to receive messages from the Guardians in her stead. While Bertha is initially reluctant to do so, she eventually goes whole hog and tries to dominate the group. She says she's in contact with a super alien called the Creator that only she can communicate with, and goes so far as to mock the previous loser aliens that Dorothy spoke to. Bertha then starts to flaunt her new power, breaking fasts and eating meat in front of the other vegetarian members of the group. I really enjoy how even the writers of the book get fed up with Bertha's shit at one point, stating, in subtle and gross ways, Bertha attacked much of the lore that Dorothy Martin had so carefully cultivated. You're not even respecting the bloody lore, Bertha! This culminates in an incredibly strange moment when Bertha claims she's about to give birth to a new Christ, awkwardly convulses for a few minutes, and, when nothing happens, says it was just a joke. After this, Dorothy's control on the group is firmly re-established. During the course of the book, Dorothy asks the group to do a lot of wacky and zany things, but she gets away with it because she is the central figure of their worldview. Her actions alone have an insulation in the mythos of the Seekers. It may be hard to accept, but to a non-insignificant percentage of the American population, this guy is a near religious icon at this point. And I don't say that lightly. I say it after reading hundreds of posts emphatically claiming that exact thing. These are people who, first and foremost, shouldn't be considered voters, but zealots, who have a level of dedication that can lead them to believe and do truly dangerous things. And no matter what happens to Q or even Trump, they aren't just going to go away.
How does a cult work when there is no central leader figure who interacts with the members on a day-to-day basis? So with Q, it's all self-perpetuating. It's all beliefs that they pass around each other. And while Q every now and then will come down and he'll give them something, he'll post something, he doesn't interact with them.
Well, that's a point that I've looked at with QAnon that makes it different than a typical destructive cult. There are three core characteristics that form the nucleus for a definition of a destructive cult. One is that, and this is the single most salient feature, is that the group has a totalitarian leader that becomes an object of worship, and that leader is the defining element and driving force of the group. Second, that the group uses influence techniques, thought reform, coercive persuasion, in order to gain undue influence over its members. And then finally, if it's a destructive cult, the influence they garner, they then use to exploit and do harm to the people in the group that are following the leader. Now, in my opinion, QAnon possesses the second characteristic and the third characteristic, because I've had many complaints from families that feel that QAnon has become a damaging influence on a loved one's life. But in regards to the absolute totalitarian leader, it's not so clear.
Personally, the most likely splinter or evolution in QAnon I see in the future is different grifters and voices for Trump emerging, with competing narratives about the war against the deep state. As a final grim thought on this matter, if you thought Elvis's death inspired a lot of conspiracy theories, just wait until Trump finally kicks the bucket. The shadow of QAnon, in one form or another, will be looming over America for decades. Now, When Prophecy Fails doesn't continue much longer after the deconfirmation of the Seeker's beliefs, and unfortunately, I couldn't find much information online about what happened to other members of the group. If anyone knows, or there are any interviews or write-ups about them, let me know, as I would be really interested. To my knowledge, the last time we hear from Dorothy Martin, however, she is still a true believer, and despite everything, is simply convinced she got the date wrong. There's a reason I began this video talking about the Seekers and cognitive dissonance. To me, the single way to view QAnon that makes the most sense, that I think gets to the very beating heart of the movement, the idea from which all the other crazy and extreme beliefs spring forth, is simple. I didn't get duped. I didn't vote for a conman grifter. I don't support a sexual predator who was friends with Jeffrey Epstein. I am not still waiting for the things he said he would do. I didn't get duped. And really, once you understand that, a lot of the out there stuff about QAnon starts to make sense. And the support bubbles and conspiracies and logical barriers put up all fit together and can seem impenetrable. But despite how impossible it may look, for a lot of people, there might still be a way out.
Well, I think the way to approach that, the way I would approach it in an intervention, is I would say to the person, let's look at other groups. Would you acknowledge that there are other groups that have been called cults? And they would probably say, oh yeah, but not my group. My group is not a cult, but there are cults. Okay, well, have you heard of the Church of Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard and so forth? I mean, that's been a widely publicized organization that has been called a cult. And they might say, yes, I've heard of Scientology. Okay, so Scientology believes in something called a suppressive person. That's an SP in Scientology's jargon. So when someone criticizes Scientology, it could be a family member, an old friend, it could be someone in the media who's reporting critical information about Scientology. They are apt to be labeled an SP. And if you associate with an SP, you are a PTS, a potential trouble source, because you're associating with an SP. And Scientology may declare someone an SP and then ask you as a Scientologist to disconnect from them. And this is a practice within Scientology. So flip that around and talking to the QAnon person, when someone is labeled or something is labeled deep state or false flag, how is that similar to being a suppressive person, an SP, or a PTS? Isn't that the same type of strategy or device to dismiss critical information that QAnon doesn't want to deal with? I mean, they don't really address it. They don't go point by point, fact by fact. Instead, they just dismiss it entirely and say, well, that's deep state. That person isn't really truly a QAnon member. That's a false flag. So wouldn't that be a parallel to Scientology? And in regards to their disconnection policy and labeling people as SPs or PTS. And if your QAnon has so much in common with Scientology, what does that mean? I mean, how does that affect you? And let's look at other groups and the verbiage that they use to dismiss people. Or as Lifton would say in his book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, to dispense with their existence. And what Lifton says is, look, the right to exist is dependent upon whether or not you accept the beliefs and the propositions, the philosophy of the group. So you can move in and out of existence on that basis. So I accept everything you tell me, QAnon, therefore I am a QAnon believer. I don't accept everything. I'm a false flag. And possibly I'm part of the deep state. So my right to exist in the world of QAnon is predicated on my concurrence, my agreement with QAnon. As long as I go along with QAnon, I have a right to exist. If I don't, I'm probably going to be labeled and dispensed with. So when a group has that kind of black and white, we, they kind of mentality, where there is no ambiguity, there is no tolerance of ambiguity or criticism, what does that mean? I mean, where does that leave you? Because I think that through criticism, we can grow and change and improve ourselves. And any organization that doesn't recognize that, what does that mean? Is it a totalitarian organization that is intolerant of any kind of criticism? I think it's tricky. I mean, for example, if you're a family member and you're trying to talk to someone that's in QAnon, you may be rather limited. I mean, you have to realize that you talk to them for maybe an hour or 2 hours, and then they get back online, and if they have doubts, they express those doubts to their fellow QAnon members online, and then those QAnon members shoot down that criticism, label it negatively, and then begin to encourage them to become more isolated socially. So sometimes family really has to be much more strategic, and that's when you possibly are going to do an intervention. And when I say intervention, that is 3 or 4 days of a person's time. So a family will plan an intervention, much like a drug or alcohol intervention, if they feel that the QAnon or whatever group it is has become such an extreme influence that is damaging the life of their family member or loved one, that they feel it's an imperative to do something. And so they may stage an intervention, which begins as a surprise, and then that person begins to be involved in a dialogue. And that dialogue will go on for 3 or 4 days. And the hope is that they will remain, they will be involved in that exchange of ideas and discussion. And there are going to be 4 things that will occupy that time in an intervention. One is a discussion about how do you define a destructive authoritarian group or a destructive cult? What are the key ingredients? Number 2, what are the influence techniques used by such groups to gain undue influence over a person and to manipulate them? For example, what we call brainwashing. What is that? It's a synthesis of coercive persuasion, thought reform, and influence techniques used by an authoritarian group. And then 3, what history of this group or problems with this group are you not aware of that you should be aware of before you continue with this group or decide to continue with this group? And then finally, the 4th block, why is your family so worried about you? Why are the people that are here now participating in this intervention, why did they stage it? What happened in your life that prompted them to do this? Because before they certainly did not. So why are they here now? And then the family will speak, the spouse, the adult children of a parent who's involved, and they'll say, well, these are the things that happened in the last year or the last several months that caused us to feel that we needed to do this. So you hope that the person will agree to stay. Typically, they only agree because they care about the people that are there. Their family, their spouse, their children, their friends. So they will agree to listen. Sometimes they'll even say, the only reason I'm going to stay is just to make you happy. And that's it. But at some point, about 70% of the people that stay in the intervention will decide to leave the group at the end. And that intervention process is something that has to be carefully planned and scheduled and so on. But that is an option for families to consider. Well, I think for any family that is concerned, the first thing I would advise them is don't be confrontational, don't be argumentative, don't start attacking the conspiracy theories. Instead, listen to the person, reaffirm your feelings to them. For example, you would say, I really love you, I care about you, and I'm interested to hear what you're reading, what you're thinking, and don't be quick to judge them. Don't tell them, oh, that's garbage, you're in a cult, QAnon is nonsense. Instead, keep your line of communication going. That's essential. And then gauge how deeply they really are involved, and then do some research about how families respond to that. And I think I've tried in my book, Cults Inside Out, there's a chapter on assessment, there's a chapter on coping strategies, and then chapters on intervention with case vignettes, and an entire chapter devoted to defining a destructive cult, and also the synthesis of influence techniques and persuasion techniques that constitute what we call brainwashing. So I think before a family takes any steps to directly intervene, they should educate themselves, understand all their options, and then they might choose to intervene, or they might choose just to continue to watch and wait. But the most important thing is to be there for that person and to make them feel that you are there for them, you still care about them, and you do not cut them off. I would say the key books would be Influence by Robert Cialdini, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert J. Lifton, and Coercive Persuasion by Edgar Schein. Some of these books are getting a little long in the tooth. They're getting a little bit old, but they're seminal books. and they established the foundation of our understanding about how coercive persuasion and thought reform work. There's also a book by Margaret Singer, a psychologist, called Cults in Our Midst, that I think is quite good. And I think my book, which has 1,200 plus research footnotes and an 18-page bibliography, kind of contextualizes a lot of this material with the proper citations. So I think those are the building blocks that people use to understand the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And if someone needs advice or needs help because they think a family member is in a cult or is falling down a conspiracy rabbit hole, where would you suggest they reach out?
Well, they can contact me through culteducation.com. They can call me, they can email me, and I can do my best to help them and advise them. And so the Cult Education Institute is a very good source of information where they can drill down and do a lot of reading. For example, there's a subsection on QAnon where they can read a great deal of information there. There's also a message board with more than 100,000 individual entries from former cult members that they can also read those, read the various information that's being shared there by former cult members who have lived through the experience.
It's currently Tuesday the 12th when I'm recording this little addendum. Trump is set to be impeached for his role in the Capitol building attack tomorrow, but I'm choosing to release my video now anyway. This is because, no matter what happens, I view this as a win for Q. Either Trump will resign or be impeached, in which case his status as a martyr is thoroughly cemented within the group, or he'll get away with it, making his supporters feel a bit better about voting Republican and giving him one last victory on the way out. When I first started this project, the goal was to prove that QAnon wasn't going anywhere, but now there are really two things that I want people watching this to take away. First off, that QAnon may be ridiculous, that doesn't mean it's ineffective. Secondly, that you don't have to be an idiot to believe in QAnon, or any conspiracy theory for that matter. We are vulnerable to manipulation, we are vulnerable to deceit, and this thing is being sold to people in 1,000 different ways. If something's being marketed well, and it's something someone wants to believe, it's pretty easy to believe it. I'm not saying everyone watching this video needs to welcome QAnon believers into their lives with open arms. A lot of these people believe very bigoted, heinous, and even dangerous things. What I am saying is that we can try to understand them a little more. We can even try to empathize with them a little bit, because the better we understand and empathize with them, the better we understand the movement. And the better we understand the movement, the better we can combat it in the future. Thanks for watching. This has been the most exhausting video I've worked on so far by a pretty wide margin. I'd like to thank Rick for helping me out with the project, along with my Patreon supporters, on screen now. If you like what I do and want to support me, my Patreon link is currently on screen. But if you want something a little meatier from me, my first game, Dead in the West, is out now, and you can pick it up here. It's a good time. If you can't spare anything though, don't worry. I just ask that you give the video a like, share, comment, or sub if you liked it. If you didn't like the video, feel free to give it a dislike, but I do reserve the right to think you're a deep state plant. Thanks again for watching.